So now that we've looked at the two world wars, we see how African masculinity, so to speak, was a factor, both in terms of how the people in French Senegal understood their recruitment, for one, but also how someone like Robert Kakembo, this Mukanda being someone from Buganda, the Kingdom of Buganda, which upon its expansion at independence would be renamed Uganda. Kakembo's 1949 manifesto, so to speak, The African Soldier Speaks, that Kurt just went over, shows a very different picture. At World War II, Africans were very eager, right, to enlist. World War I, the French colonial commandants had to literally engage in slaving tactics, right, to recruit Africans as soldiers in their army. By World War II, there was this eagerness, and it would bear reading a few paragraphs from Kakembo's diary or journal, if you will, to understand how he explains this eagerness on the part of Africans. He writes, quote, "I would like to make it clear that the majority of the African soldiers, as at World War II, came into the army not to fight for King George VI, to defend the empire. No, the king and the empire meant and still mean nothing to them. Men, you see, in the forces, came to help a certain kindly lady missionary or a good district commissioner whose wife plays with their children. They came to help because their friend and lady told them that back home in Britain, her or his mother was in trouble, that a fierce bully was threatening to take them slaves, and that if they joined the army, they might help to avert that threat and danger to their beloved ones." So the forms of personal relationships that had been formed between European missionary and colonial officials on the one hand and Africans within the colonies shaped African understanding of the World War II as a threat to the families and welfare of the acquaintances or the familiar Europeans that they knew. Second, Kakembo writes, quote, "There was another kind of African who joined the army because he knew what German conquest of the world meant. This type of African had read or heard of what Hitler wrote in his famous book, Mein Kampf, regarding Africans. And take it from me, those men bore and still bear Hitler a grudge for having written the following words." Here he quotes Hitler. "From time to time, our illustrated papers publish the news that in some quarters of the globe, a Negro has become a lawyer, a teacher, a pastor, or even a grand opera tenor. This is sin against reason itself. It is an act of criminal insanity to train a being who is only a semi-ape till you can pretend that he has turned into a lawyer." So Kakembo is suggesting that Africans who enlisted were in the Allies' armies were aware of these discourses and that it informed their desire to fight. The third motivation he writes about has to do with economic social ascendancy. Quote, "Then there were those who came into the army later just to get a job and get money. The soldiers go home on leave, smartly dressed in his Majesty's uniform and with plenty of money," and so on and so forth. So after World War II, Europe was infrastructurally and financially vulnerable. And European imperial nations looked to their African colonies for rehabilitation. Africans who themselves had fought in the war, had suffered human and material losses, in turn believed that they had earned the right to independence. If Kakembo, for instance, and his vision of the social democracy that Kurt just described is anything to go by, we can sort of see how this process evolved. In the view of African participants in World War II, if the war had been fought to stop fascism's anti-democratic policies and notions of Aryan racial superiority, how could colonialism continue to be possibly condoned within their homelands? I mean, if we sort of pause to think on a broader scale and think about the original motivations for European nations attempting to acquire colonies in the first place, it was nationalism. It was European nationalism, right? So it is rather remarkable that having earlier driven the process of European imperialism, that nationalism would play such a major role in the disintegration of European empires in the mid-20th century. The African nationalism that we're going to be looking at in the post-World War II period entailed the reconciliation of the elite-led urban print culture, anti-colonialism. They reconciled this sort of elite form of nationalism with a broader rural, grassroots-based mass mobilization. And that second rural, grassroots mass mobilization is really what the Igbo Women's War typified. The Igbo Women's War that we looked at last week. So what we're looking at then is that in the post-World War II period, African educated elite, including ex-soldiers of World War II, many of them who would go on to be educated in the European metropoles, would articulate a capacious vision of immediate independence. But to make that happen, they had to bring together the urban dwellers and the rural dwellers and articulate to realize a radical political vision of liberation. Yes, Jeremy.
So if the Africans took the Second World War more personally, with various reasons, they performed better in battle because they saw World War II as a way to ascend, and also that the most important goal for many of them was to stop Germany taking over the world as opposed to World War I.
Yeah, there were numerous. There were several accounts of African valorous performances during World War II,
and more so than the first.
More so than the first.
Well, couldn't that just be because they were recognized as people more than they were in the First World War?
Yeah, that could be. So I mean, there is no monocausal agents, no monocausal factor in history. These were a conjuncture of factors. With Robert Kakembo himself, an African soldier who served, narrates his own experience and his own understanding. It's very entirely subjective, right, of why he thought Africans participated in the war. But we cannot generalize or say that his particular experiences was representative of the experiences of all Africans who participated in the war. But it does give us a perspective, right, into some of the motivations for African participation. So, but apart from the sort of the local anti-colonial organization, African nationalism in the post-World War II era also involved international efforts. Through critical collaborative international congresses, African and Asian colonized peoples transformed the United Nations into a prestigious platform for anti-colonial agitation. So Africans would view the decolonization of India in the late 1940s as the promise of their own independence, because they saw a more global Afro-Asian struggle for liberation from European colonialism. At the same time, both the United States and the Soviet Union, the new global superpowers, were opposed to the old European colonial empires, even as they fostered empire-like international relationships of their own. The United States condemned colonialism because it violated the Atlantic Charter of 1941. The Soviets opposed colonialism because Lenin and other Marxist thinkers had defined it as, quote, the highest stage of capitalism. However, European imperial nations were not ready to give up their colonies. Britain and France pursued a middle ground approach in the post-war era. They made a series of social and political and economic conciliations to their colonized Africans, but they were not ready for immediate independence. The Belgian officials in the Congo dismissed any talk of independence for Congo and rather proposed, as at 1947, that perhaps in 30 years, a limited form of Congolese self-government would be possible. The Belgian case is significant because one of our case studies of Neo-Colonialism would be Patrice Emery Lumumba's assassination, the first elected prime minister of Congo, who was assassinated by a co-joint mercenary venture of Belgian officials and the United States intelligence agency. In Portuguese African colonies, such as Mozambique and Angola, there were no change in colonial policies after World War II. Then in settler colonies like French Algeria, British Kenya, which we've examined briefly, and South Africa, the white minority entertained no hope of African independence and actively blocked the extension of more rights to Africans. So the second generation educated elite, African educated elite in the post-war era, were predominantly male. They were thoroughly familiar with European culture. Having studied in European metropoles, they were keenly aware of the gap between European values, political values, and colonial practices. They found a ready audience of anxious activists among the predominantly impoverished African men and women who had migrated to African cities en masse in the post-war decade. And they also found allies among veterans of the world wars, young people with some education but no jobs commensurate with their expectation, a small class of urban wage workers who were increasingly aware of their exploitation, a small cadre of small-scale female traders who were very resentful of European monopolies and privileges, as well as rural dwellers who had lost land or who suffered forced labor and heavy taxation. So you had a sort of a diverse classes of people who found in the new ideology of anti-colonialism and nationalism the potential realization of their own visions. The post-war anti-colonialism was also Pan-Africanist in its ideology and global in its orientation. The 1945 Pan-Africanist Congress in London and the 1955 First Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, and the active African participation in these conferences and congresses exemplify the sort of international orientation of African nationalism in the post-World War II era. The London Congress was attended by educated nationalists such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Hastings Banda, and Nnamdi Azikiwe. They called for immediate independence. They increasingly advocated for self-government through petitions, litigations, radio and newspaper mobilization, the creation of mass political parties, which was critical. In a popular definition of this emerging anti-colonial sentiment, the Nigerian nationalist Nnamdi Azikiwe stated in 1949, quote, "We define imperialism as the enforced rule of one nation by another nation. This we hold to be the antithesis of democracy, for the realization of which our sons have shed their blood in 2 world wars. Therefore, we are compelled to denounce imperialism as a crime against humanity because it destroys human dignity and is a constant cause of wars." You can see that the language that Azikiwe is using itself was a global one. It was a post-World War II discourse that was mobilizing the language of the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations, the pronouncements of Winston Churchill, the Soviet as well as US discourses as well.